The shattering of glass sent a tremor through the earth, like a premonition. Charlie Winters barely ducked in time as another pane exploded from the prison camp window, showering him with glittering fragments as he patrolled the fence line. April in Texas meant windstorms, but this one had teeth. "Take cover, Winters!" Lieutenant Hoffman bellowed from the guardhouse. Charlie pressed himself against the outer wall of Camp Swift, feeling the wooden boards rattle against his back. 23 years old, and he'd never left Bastrop County until the Army rejected him for flat feet. Now he guarded German prisoners instead of fighting overseas, a fact that burned like acid in his gut. The Germans, nearly 4,000 of them, had arrived in January 1943, and now April's wildflowers bloomed around their prison. Charlie watched them work the fields every day, their youth and vigor intact while his friends died across the Atlantic. The shame of it colored everything he did. The enemy deserves nothing but contempt, his father had told him the day the rejection letter came. You guard those Nazi bastards and remember what they've done. Charlie believed it with every fiber. He'd hardened his heart against their humanity. They weren't men but symbols of what had taken his opportunity for valor. He wouldn't fail in this duty, even if it wasn't the one he'd wanted. Inside the administrative building, Charlie stamped mud from his boots. The storm had driven everyone indoors, and now he had to file incident reports about the broken windows. Captain Miller glanced up from his desk. "Winters, take these to the translator's office. Need all these letters checked before mail call." Charlie accepted the stack of envelopes, outgoing mail from the prisoners. Every letter was read, censored, stamped. Nothing could compromise American security, not even a German farm boy writing to his mother. The translation office had been set up in what was once a storage closet. Charlie knocked twice, then entered without waiting for a response. Inside, a young woman sat at a desk, her honey-brown hair falling in loose waves around her face as she bent over a letter. She looked up, and Charlie felt a strange tightening in his chest. "Private Winters," she said with a faint smile. "More letters?" "Miss Osterman." He placed the stack on her desk. "Captain wants these processed by tomorrow." Claudia Osterman was the daughter of German immigrants who had fled the rising Nazi Party years before. Her fluency in German made her invaluable to camp operations. Charlie had seen her a dozen times but had never looked closely before. Now he noticed the small scar above her right eyebrow, the green flecks in her hazel eyes. "The prisoners are getting restless with the storm," he said, unsure why he was still standing there. "Broken windows in the East Barracks." "Anyone hurt?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. Charlie stiffened. "Does it matter?" Her eyes flashed. "They're human beings, Private Winters." "They're the enemy," he corrected her. "My brother is fighting them in France right now." Claudia's expression softened. "My cousin is fighting for the Americans in Italy. My uncle died in Dachau for opposing Hitler. This war isn't as simple as you think." Before Charlie could respond, the door opened and Captain Miller leaned in. "Winters, we've got a situation. One of the prisoners collapsed in the fields. Take him to the infirmary." Outside, the wind had died down, but dark clouds still threatened overhead. 2 guards flanked a slumped figure, half carrying him across the muddy yard. As Charlie approached, he saw it was one of the younger prisoners, a lanky, fair-haired boy who couldn't be more than 19. "What happened?" Charlie demanded. "Heat exhaustion, maybe," one guard suggested. "Or he's faking to get out of work." The German's face was alarmingly pale, his breathing shallow. Charlie took the prisoner's arm, feeling the bones beneath the thin fabric of his uniform marked with the letters PW. "I've got him," Charlie said. "Get back to your posts." In the infirmary, the camp doctor was dealing with cuts from the broken glass. Charlie eased the prisoner onto an empty cot. "Name?" he asked, reaching for the intake clipboard. The German looked at him through fevered eyes. "Conrad," he said weakly. "Conrad Weiss." Charlie wrote it down, surprised to find his hand hesitating over the paper. This was the first time he'd asked a prisoner his name rather than reading it off a roster or prisoner number. "Sit tight, Weiss. Doctor will get to you." As he turned to leave, the German caught his sleeve with surprising strength. "Dank," he whispered, then slipped into unconsciousness. That night, Charlie couldn't sleep. The German's face, Conrad's face, kept appearing in his mind. He told himself it was just the strange coincidence of their names both starting with the same letter, nothing more. But something had shifted, like the ground after an earthquake, imperceptible but fundamentally altered. The next morning, Charlie found himself outside the translation office again, this time without orders or mail to deliver. Claudia looked up, surprised. "Private Winters." "That prisoner yesterday," he began awkwardly. "Conrad Weiss. Do you know anything about him?" She studied him for a moment, then opened a drawer and pulled out a file. He was captured in North Africa. 20 years old, from Bavaria. His letters are mostly to his mother and younger sister. "Is he?" Charlie struggled with the question. "Is he a Nazi?" "Many German soldiers aren't Nazis, Private. They're conscripted boys who had no choice." She pushed a letter across the desk. This one was flagged for censorship last week. He wrote about missing his father, who died for harboring a Jewish family. Charlie stared at the letter, the German words meaningless to him but suddenly weighted with significance. "I shouldn't be showing you this," Claudia said quietly. "Why are you?" She met his eyes steadily. "Because you asked his name. That's the first step to seeing someone as human." Over the next weeks, Charlie found reasons to visit the translation office. Claudia would share small details from the prisoner's letters, a baker missing his ovens, a teacher worrying about his students, a new father who had never seen his child. Charlie began to see the camp differently, noticing individual faces among what had once been a faceless enemy mass. He volunteered for infirmary duty, telling himself it was to keep an eye on Conrad Weiss, who was recovering from pneumonia. The first time Conrad was well enough to speak, Charlie found himself lingering after delivering medications. "You are not like other guards," Conrad observed, his English halting but clear. Charlie stiffened. "What do you mean?" "You look us in the eyes. The others look through us, like we are ghosts." That night, Charlie wrote a letter to his brother in France, asking questions he'd never considered before. What were the German soldiers like? Did they seem evil, or just men following orders? He sealed it, knowing it would be weeks before he received an answer, if ever. The next day, he found a folded paper slipped into his jacket pocket, a note in elegant handwriting: "Meet me by the south storage shed after your shift. Important matter to discuss." CO Claudia was waiting when he arrived, pacing nervously. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said immediately. "But I thought you should know. Conrad Weiss is being transferred to another camp next week." "Why tell me this?" Charlie asked, though something in his chest constricted at the news. "Because I've been reading his letters." "And yours?" "Mine? What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath. 2 weeks ago, Conrad gave me a letter to translate for him. It was addressed to you." Charlie felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath him. "That's impossible. Prisoners can't write to guards." "I know. That's why he asked me to help." He wanted to thank you for treating him with dignity. She hesitated. I translated it, but I never delivered it. I was afraid it would get you both in trouble. She pressed a folded paper into his hand. But now that he's leaving, I thought you should have it. Later, alone in his quarters, Charlie unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Dear Private Winters, I write to thank you for the small kindnesses that are large in this place. The extra bread you left by my bed. The book of Texas history you accidentally left in the infirmary. The moment you stood between me and the guard who wanted to punish me for being too ill to work. Before I came here, they told us Americans were all gangsters and cowboys. Perhaps you are a cowboy. I hear you speak of your father's ranch. But you are also a man with a good heart, even toward an enemy. If we had met in another time, another place, perhaps we could have been friends. With respect, Conrad Weiss. Charlie read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and hid it beneath his mattress. Something had been unlocked inside him, something he had kept firmly shuttered since the day his draft rejection arrived. The following morning, he sought out Claudia. I need to write back to him, he said without preamble. Can you translate? Her eyes widened. Charlie, that's extremely dangerous. For both of you. I know. He met her gaze steadily. But some things matter more than danger. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Be careful what you write. Nothing that could be seen as fraternizing with the enemy. Charlie spent hours drafting his response, crossing out lines, starting over. When he finally handed the paper to Claudia, it read simply, Weiss, in Texas, we believe a man should be judged by his character, not where he was born. Stay strong. Better days are coming. Winters. 2 days later, Conrad was loaded onto a transport truck bound for a camp in Oklahoma. As the truck pulled away, their eyes met briefly. No words, just a moment of recognition of shared humanity across an unbridgeable divide. Charlie thought that would be the end of it. A brief connection, meaningful but finite. Then Claudia approached him in the mess hall, sliding onto the bench across from him. He wrote again, she whispered, keeping her face neutral as other guards moved around them. Through the Red Cross. Addressed to me, but meant for you. How is that possible? I mentioned I had a cousin in the service. He addressed it to your cowboy cousin. The censors thought he meant my actual cousin. That night, Charlie read Conrad's letter by flashlight in his bunk. Dear Cowboy, Oklahoma has too much sky and not enough trees. The work is harder here, but I think of Texas wildflowers and find strength. Do they still bloom near the fence where we talked that day? I keep your words with me. A man should be judged by his character. I hope to live by that. Your distant friend, C.W. Charlie stared at the signature, C.W., the same as his own initials. As though they were two sides of the same coin, separated only by circumstance. He began to write back, using Claudia as their go-between. Each letter carefully coded, nothing explicitly stating their growing friendship. They wrote of books, of farming techniques, of the vast Texas sky compared to the Bavarian mountains. Conrad described his home, a small village where his family had kept bees for generations. Charlie wrote about his father's cattle ranch, the smell of mesquite smoke, the way sunset turned the fields to gold. Claudia watched their correspondence with a mixture of concern and compassion. Be careful, she warned repeatedly. This is dangerous ground. But the letters continued, growing more personal with each exchange. Conrad wrote of his fears that his mother and sister wouldn't survive the bombing raids. Charlie confessed his shame at not fighting alongside his brother. You serve with honor where you are placed, Conrad wrote. That is all any man can do. Summer faded into fall, and Charlie found himself transformed. The prisoners were no longer a faceless mass but individuals with stories, hopes, fears. He began slipping extra rations to the weakest ones, intervening when guards grew too harsh. Captain Miller noticed the change. "You've gone soft on these krauts, Winters," he remarked one day. "Remember who they are." "I know exactly who they are, sir," Charlie replied, meeting his commander's gaze steadily. In October, the letter that changed everything arrived. Claudia found Charlie during his patrol, her face pale. "Emergency meeting at the usual place," she whispered as she passed. Behind the storage shed, her hand shook as she handed him Conrad's latest letter. "This one was nearly intercepted," she said. "Charlie, it's too dangerous. You need to stop this correspondence." But as he read, the world seemed to stop turning. "My dear Charlie, I write with news I can barely contain. They are sending me back to Texas, to Camp Swift. A prisoner exchange program between camps. By the time you read this, I will be on my way. The thought of seeing Texas wildflowers again, anew, makes this burden lighter. What began as gratitude has grown into something I cannot name in writing. Perhaps when we meet again, I can find the courage to speak what my heart knows but my pen dares not write. Until then, I remain yours, Conrad." Charlie looked up, his heart pounding. "He's coming back." Claudia nodded, her expression grave. "Charlie, you need to understand what's happening. The way he writes to you, this isn't just friendship." "I know," he said quietly. Her eyes widened slightly. "And you still want to continue?" "I don't know what I want," he admitted. "I only know that when I read his words, something makes sense that never did before." The transport arrived 3 days later. Charlie volunteered for intake duty, scanning the faces of each descending prisoner until he saw him, thinner than before, a new scar along his jawline, but unmistakably Conrad. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment before Charlie looked away, afraid his face would reveal too much. That night, unable to sleep, Charlie slipped out to patrol the fence line. The November air carried a bite of coming winter. He walked to the eastern edge of the compound where a small grove of oak trees cast long shadows in the moonlight. A figure stood among the trees, just inside the fence. "Conrad! You shouldn't be out here," Charlie said, approaching slowly. "It's past curfew." "I volunteered for night gardening detail," Conrad replied, gesturing to a spade and bucket nearby. The captain approved it. Charlie glanced around, confirming they were alone, then stepped closer to the fence. "Your letters," he began, then faltered. "I meant every word," Conrad said softly. They stood in silence, separated by steel wire and the insurmountable reality of their positions, guard and prisoner, American and German, divided by a war that ground on relentlessly across the ocean. "I don't understand this," Charlie finally said, his voice barely audible. "Any of it." "Nor do I," Conrad answered. "I only know that when I write to you, I feel human again." A searchlight swept across the yard, and Charlie stepped back instinctively. "I have to go. But I'll be on duty here tomorrow night." As winter deepened, they established a routine. Charlie would patrol the eastern fence, and Conrad would find reasons to be there, gardening, repairs, cleaning detail. They would talk, careful to maintain physical distance, always alert for other guards. Sometimes they would simply stand in companionable silence, sharing the same stars. Claudia continued to translate their letters, which they now exchanged directly during these meetings. The letters said what they couldn't speak aloud, feelings that had no place in wartime, dreams of a future that couldn't exist. "If the world were different," Charlie wrote, "I would show you my father's ranch. The sunset from the western ridge makes a man believe in God. When peace comes, Conrad replied, I will take you to the lake near my village. The water is so clear you can see the mountains reflected perfectly, like two worlds touching. Christmas approached, bringing a dusting of rare Texas snow and a momentary softening in the camp's atmosphere. The prisoners prepared a small concert, singing German carols that made even the hardest guards pause and listen. Charlie stood at the back of the recreation hall, watching as Conrad sang with the others, his voice rising clear and strong. For a moment, it was possible to forget they were enemies, to imagine they were simply men sharing music on a winter evening. Captain Miller appeared beside him. Interesting, isn't it, Winters? How music can make you forget what they've done. So? Miller's eyes were cold. Don't think I haven't noticed your special interest in certain prisoners. Particularly that one. He nodded toward Conrad. Fraternization is a serious offense. I'm just doing my job, sir, Charlie said, but felt cold fear spreading through his chest. See that you remember what that job is, Miller replied. These men aren't your friends. They're the enemy, and they'll turn on you the moment it serves their purpose. That night, Charlie wrote a warning to Conrad, we must be more careful. Eyes are watching. But it was already too late. The next morning, Charlie was summoned to Miller's office. On the desk lay several letters, their letters, and beside them sat Claudia, her face streaked with tears. Private Winters, Miller said coldly, you are hereby charged with fraternization with the enemy and conduct unbecoming a guard of this facility. Claudia wouldn't meet his eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. They found them in my desk. I had to explain. Miss Osterman has been cooperative, Miller continued. She claims she translated these letters against her better judgment, at your insistence. Given her valuable skills and clean record, she will receive only a reprimand. He fixed Charlie with a hard stare. You, however, face more serious consequences. What about Weiss? Charlie asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. Prisoner Weiss has been placed in solitary confinement pending transfer to a maximum security facility. His fate is not your concern. Charlie stood rigid, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. Captain, he's done nothing wrong. He's a German soldier, Winters. That's wrong enough. Miller slid a form across the desk. You have a choice. Sign this confession, accept your dishonorable discharge, and this remains an internal matter. Or face court-martial with all the public shame that entails for your family. Charlie stared at the paper, seeing his future crumble before him. Disgraced, unemployable, his family name tarnished, all for letters exchanged with a prisoner of war. Letters that spoke of friendship, of understanding, of a connection that transcended the arbitrary lines of conflict. And Conrad, sent to a maximum security facility where the guards would be harsher, the conditions more brutal. Because Charlie had forgotten what his uniform meant, what boundaries couldn't be crossed. May I have time to consider? He asked. Miller nodded curtly. 24 hours. Until then, you're relieved of duty. Confined to quarters. Outside Miller's office, Claudia caught up to him. Charlie, I'm so sorry, she began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. Not here, he murmured, conscious of watchful eyes. Later, she slipped into his quarters, her face drawn with worry. They threatened my family, she explained. Said they'd investigate my parents' citizenship, suggest they had German sympathies. She clutched his arm. I didn't tell them everything. Just that I translated letters as a favor. Nothing about, she hesitated. About what Conrad and I feel for each other, Charlie finished. What are you going to do? Charlie sat heavily on his bunk. I don't know. I can accept disgrace for myself, but Conrad, he broke off, the thought of Conrad in a maximum security facility too painful to articulate. There might be a way, Claudia said carefully. Captain Miller's clerk owes me a favor. I know where they're keeping Conrad, and when they plan to transfer him. What are you suggesting? Her eyes met his, steady and determined. Something dangerous. Something that could cost us everything. The plan took shape in whispered conversations. Claudia would create a distraction in the administrative building, a small, controlled fire in the waste bin. During the confusion, Charlie would use his guard credentials to access the solitary confinement cells and free Conrad. They would escape in the supply truck that made evening deliveries to the nearby town. And then what? Charlie asked. We'd be fugitives. They'd hunt us down. My uncle has a fishing cabin in Mexico, Claudia replied. It's isolated, off any maps. You could stay there until the war ends, then figure out next steps. Why would you risk this for us? She smiled sadly. Because I've read your letters. Both of yours. And in a world torn apart by hate, what you two found is worth protecting. That night, Charlie couldn't sleep. He paced his small room, weighing impossible choices. Disgrace versus desertion. Safety versus freedom. Duty versus, what? Love? Was that what had grown between him and Conrad through months of letters and fence-line conversations? As dawn broke, Charlie made his decision. He wrote 2 letters, one to his parents explaining what he could, one to his brother apologizing for not being the soldier he had hoped to be. Then he burned them both, knowing they could never be sent. At dusk, the plan began. Claudia's accidental fire sent guards rushing to the administrative building. Charlie, still in uniform but stripped of his armband designating active duty, walked purposefully toward the solitary confinement cells. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. The guard on duty barely glanced at him. Thought you were relieved, Winters. Special orders, Charlie replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. Captain wants the German prisoner brought for additional questioning. The guard shrugged and unlocked the cell. Inside, Conrad sat on a narrow cot, his face bruised, eyes hollow until they fell on Charlie. Recognition flashed, followed by confusion, then understanding as Charlie gestured subtly for silence. Come with me, prisoner, Charlie ordered gruffly, handcuffing Conrad's wrists in front of him, loosely, so they could be slipped off if needed. They walked across the compound, Charlie's hand on Conrad's arm, both men rigid with tension. The supply truck waited by the kitchen, engine idling as the last crates were loaded. Charlie steered Conrad toward it, eyes scanning constantly for any sign they'd been discovered. Seconds stretched like hours as they approached the truck. 20 yards. 10. 5. Winters. Captain Miller's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. Charlie froze, then slowly turned. Miller stood 30 feet away, his sidearm drawn and pointed directly at them. Step away from the prisoner, Miller ordered. Charlie's mind raced. They were too far from cover, too exposed. If they ran, Miller would shoot. If they surrendered, Conrad would face worse punishment, and Charlie would be court-martialed for attempted desertion, possibly executed. I can't do that, sir, Charlie replied, keeping his body between Miller and Conrad. This is treason, Winters. Do you understand that? Treason in wartime. I understand duty, sir. To country, to uniform. Charlie took a deep breath. But also to humanity. Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance, Winters. Step aside. Time slowed to a crawl. Charlie felt Conrad's hand on his shoulder, heard him whisper, "Don't do this." Not for me. But it wasn't just for Conrad. It was for the man Charlie had become through their letters, someone who could see beyond propaganda and hate, who understood that humanity existed on both sides of any conflict. A shot rang out, but not from Miller's gun. The captain crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Behind him stood Claudia, a small pistol in her shaking hands. "Go," she shouted. "Now!" Charlie pushed Conrad toward the truck, both men scrambling into the cab as guards began pouring from the administration building. The driver, bewildered by the commotion, barely had time to protest before Charlie pressed Claudia's uncle's pistol to his ribs. "Drive," he ordered. "Through the gate. Now!" The truck lurched forward, gaining speed as it approached the main gate. The guards there, alerted by the gunshot, raised their rifles. "Get down!" Charlie yelled, pushing Conrad below the dashboard as bullets pinged against the truck's metal body. The driver, motivated by the gun at his side, crashed through the wooden barrier, and suddenly they were outside the camp, barreling down the dark road toward town. 5 miles later, Charlie ordered the driver to stop. "Get out and start walking," he instructed, keeping the gun visible. "Don't look back." The man didn't argue, disappearing into the night as Charlie slid behind the wheel. Beside him, Conrad worked his wrists free from the handcuffs. "We'll never make it," he said quietly. "They'll have roadblocks up by morning." "We're not heading for the roads," Charlie replied, turning the truck onto a narrow dirt track that led into the dense pine forests along the Colorado River. "My father has a hunting cabin about 40 miles from here. We can hide there until things quiet down, then make for the border." Conrad was silent for a long moment. "Why did you do this? Your life, your future, all destroyed." Charlie kept his eyes on the rough path ahead. "I've spent 2 years guarding men I was taught to hate, men who were supposedly the enemy. Then I met one who made me question everything I thought I knew." He glanced sideways. "Your letters changed me, Conrad. They showed me a world beyond this war, beyond these arbitrary divisions." Conrad's hand found his in the darkness. "So did yours." They reached the cabin well after midnight, a small structure nestled among towering pines, invisible from the main roads. It had been years since Charlie had visited, but the key remained hidden under the same loose stone by the door. Inside, the air was musty but the roof sound. A small wood stove provided heat, and an old pump behind the cabin still drew clear water. They would be safe here for a while. As dawn broke, they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching pink light filter through the trees. The enormity of what they had done, what they had sacrificed, hung heavy between them. "What happens when the war ends?" Conrad finally asked. "I don't know," Charlie admitted. "I can never go back to my old life. You'll have to decide if you return to Germany." "There may be nothing to return to," Conrad said softly. "My village was near Dresden." They fell silent again, each contemplating a future that had seemed impossible just days ago, a future they might share. "I never thought I'd be a fugitive in my own country," Charlie said with a mirthless laugh. Conrad's hand found his. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that your letters saved me. When I felt I might disappear into the mass of prisoners, become nothing but a number, your words reminded me I was still a man." Charlie turned to him, seeing in the growing light all that had been hidden during their furtive meetings at the fence, the gentle strength in Conrad's eyes, the determination in the set of his jaw, the humanity that transcended the uniform he'd been forced to wear. "We'll figure this out," Charlie promised. "One day at a time." For 2 weeks, they lived in careful isolation. Charlie ventured out only to hunt and to listen for news at a distant farmhouse radio. The war in Europe ground on, but rumors of Germany's imminent collapse grew stronger. In the nearby towns, wanted posters bore their names and faces. Then came the day that changed everything again. Charlie returned from checking his snares to find Conrad sitting rigid by the radio, his face ashen. "What is it?" Charlie asked, setting down the rabbits he'd caught. "Hitler is dead," Conrad said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Germany has surrendered." The words hung in the air between them, monumental in their simplicity. The war in Europe was over. The enemy was no longer the enemy. "What does this mean for us?" Conrad asked, looking up with eyes that held both hope and fear. Charlie sank into the chair across from him. "I don't know. You're not a prisoner of war anymore, but I'm still a deserter." That night, they made a fire outside the cabin and sat beneath stars that suddenly seemed brighter. The war that had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances was ending, leaving them in a strange limbo, neither free nor captive. "I could turn myself in," Conrad suggested. "Tell them I forced you to help me escape. With the war over, they might be lenient." Charlie shook his head firmly. "No. I made my choice knowingly." He stared into the flames. "Besides, what I did, desertion during wartime, there's no leniency for that." "Then we run," Conrad said simply. "Mexico, South America, wherever we can start new lives." "Is that what you want?" "To leave everything behind." Conrad's eyes met his across the fire. "What is there to leave?" "My home is likely destroyed, my country occupied. The only letters I've had in 2 years that meant anything were yours." He reached for Charlie's hand. "Where you are, that's where I want to be." 3 days later, a truck rattled up the overgrown path to the cabin. Charlie grabbed the pistol and motioned for Conrad to hide in the root cellar they'd prepared for just such a moment. But the figure that emerged from the truck was familiar, Claudia, her hair hidden under a scarf, her face taut with urgency. "You need to come back," she said without preamble when Charlie opened the door. "Both of you." "That's insane," Charlie replied, glancing back as Conrad emerged from hiding. "We'd be arrested on sight." "No, you wouldn't," Claudia insisted, pulling a newspaper from her bag. "Everything's changed. President Truman has issued a limited amnesty for deserters under certain conditions. And with the German surrender, there's chaos in the POW processing. Records are being lost, stories confused." She spread the paper on the table. The headline announced the amnesty program, a chance for American soldiers who had deserted to return under reduced penalties, provided they hadn't aided the enemy. "That doesn't help us," Charlie said. "I helped a German prisoner escape." "Not according to the news story," Claudia replied, her eyes bright with determination. "According to what I've arranged, you were conducting an authorized prisoner transport when the truck was ambushed. You were both taken captive and have been hiding in the forest, afraid for your lives. With the war's end, you're voluntarily returning." Conrad stared at her in disbelief. "Who would believe that?" "Captain Miller would have denied it," Claudia admitted, "but he's been transferred to Washington after recovering from his wound. The new captain is overwhelmed with processing prisoner repatriations. He just wants clean paperwork." She pulled out more documents, official-looking forms with military stamps. "I work in administration now. These orders show you were authorized to transport prisoner Weiss for specialized agricultural work." She met Charlie's gaze steadily. "It can work. The war is over, Charlie. No one wants more casualties now." For 3 days, they debated the risk. return and face possible imprisonment, or continue running and leave behind any chance of a legitimate future. In the end, it was Conrad who decided. If we run forever, they win, he said quietly. The hate, the fear, it all continues. But if we go back and face this, maybe we show that something good can come from this war. That humanity can survive. On a bright May morning, they loaded into Claudia's truck and began the journey back. Charlie felt oddly calm, as though returning to face consequences was the first truly free choice he'd made. At the camp gates, now guarded more laxly than before, they surrendered themselves to a startled young private who immediately called for the captain. They were separated, interrogated, their story examined from every angle. Charlie repeated the tale Claudia had constructed, the ambush, the captivity, the fear of returning until news of Germany's surrender reached them. Conrad told the same story in another room, their accounts matching in every detail Claudia had carefully rehearsed with them. For 3 days, they were held in separate quarters while the military authorities deliberated. Charlie prepared himself for the worst, taking comfort only in knowing that Conrad, as a prisoner of a defeated nation, would likely be repatriated safely. On the 4th day, the camp captain summoned Charlie to his office. The man looked tired, drowning in paperwork from the chaotic end of the European conflict. "Your story checks out, Winters," he said without preamble. The ambush was reported, though details were scarce. "With the amnesty program and your voluntary return, you're being processed for honorable discharge." He pushed a form across the desk. "Sign here." Charlie stared at the document, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Sir, what about Weiss, the prisoner?" The captain waved dismissively. "Processing for repatriation like all the others. Though in his case, there's a complication." He shuffled through papers. "Seems his hometown is in the Soviet occupation zone. He's requested asylum." "Asylum?" "Here in America." "Something about his father hiding Jews, fear of Soviet reprisals." The captain shrugged. "Not my department. Immigration will handle it." Charlie signed the discharge papers with a hand that barely shook, afraid to ask more questions that might unravel their miraculous reprieve. Outside, Claudia waited, her face breaking into a relieved smile when she saw him. "It worked," she said softly. "How did you manage this?" Charlie asked as they walked toward the administration building where he would receive his final orders. "I had help," she admitted. "My parents know people in Washington, German Americans with influence. And the military has bigger concerns now than one guard and one prisoner with an unusual story." "And Conrad? Is he really applying for asylum?" She nodded. "I've arranged for a sponsor family in Austin, friends of my parents who will vouch for him. Former Germans who became citizens years ago." She squeezed his arm. "It's not guaranteed, but with his father's record of resistance, his chances are good." 2 weeks later, Charlie stood on the platform of the Austin train station, watching passengers disembark from the Fort Worth line. His discharge papers were folded neatly in his pocket, his civilian clothes still stiff and unfamiliar after years in uniform. Then he saw him, Conrad, carrying a small military-issued duffel bag, looking uncertain until their eyes met across the crowded platform. Neither man moved for a long moment, separated not by a fence or war but by the simple, mundane bustle of peacetime America. Conrad reached him first, stopping just short of an embrace that would draw unwanted attention. "Your letters never mentioned how beautiful Austin is," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Charlie could see in his eyes. "There's a lot my letters couldn't say," Charlie replied. They walked side by side through streets untouched by war, toward the small apartment Charlie had rented with his mustering out pay. It was in a quiet neighborhood where questions were few and tolerance was possible, if unspoken. "What did you tell your family?" Conrad asked as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "That I met someone during the war. Someone who changed everything." Charlie unlocked the door to their new home, small, sparse, but theirs. "They think you're a nurse I met at a military hospital. And when they want to meet this nurse, we'll face that when it comes." Charlie closed the door behind them, finally free to reach for Conrad's hand. "One step at a time, remember." Conrad set down his bag and looked around the apartment, then back at Charlie. "After all we've survived, I believe we can face anything." In the years that followed, they built a life together in the margins of society, quiet, careful, but fundamentally their own. Conrad's asylum was granted, partly through Claudia's family connections and partly through the growing sympathy for Germans who had opposed Hitler. Charlie found work as a ranch foreman outside Austin, where Conrad's farming knowledge proved invaluable. They lived in the foreman's cottage, their relationship disguised as roommates sharing expenses in the post-war economy. Their letters continued, though now they left them for each other around their small home, on pillows, tucked into lunch pails, pressed between the pages of shared books. Letters that could finally speak freely of the love that had begun in the most unlikely of places, between supposed enemies separated by war but united by something stronger than hate. On the 5th anniversary of VE Day, they sat on the porch of their cottage, watching the same stars that had shone over both Texas and Bavaria, over both prison camp and hunting cabin. "Do you ever regret it?" Conrad asked. "What you gave up for this, for us?" Charlie considered the question, thinking of the conventional life he might have had, marriage, children, the uncomplicated respect of his community. But then he thought of the man beside him, of the journey that had brought them here, of the understanding they had found across enemy lines. "Not for a moment," he said, reaching for Conrad's hand in the safety of darkness. "Some things are worth any price." As the world rebuilt itself from the ashes of war, so too did they build something new from what conflict had given them, an understanding that transcended boundaries, a connection forged in letters that had kept their secret until love could finally bloom freely in peace.